Yeah, I apologize in advance if you can hear my daughter crying in the background, but that's something you may have to live with. She's with my grandparents and they're struggling to deal with it. So yeah, I'm going to talk about climate change and how important it is, the scale of the risk, and discuss some different scenarios, and hopefully shed some light on the cause. So I'm going to focus on two things. The first part is on the sort of business as usual scenario, which you can think of as current policy, or like the policies we're most likely to have over the next 80 years. And then there's the lower probability worst case scenarios. What does that look like? How likely is it, and how bad would it be? And this is relevant from an effective altruism point of view, because we want to be able to compare climate change to other big problems like nuclear war and pandemics and transformative AI. So yeah, understanding its scale is very important. Hasn't received that much attention in EA. So that's why we're here. So I think for a long time in effective altruism and in certain parts of climate economics, there had been a lot of focus on tail risks of climate change. And that depends on three things. The first being how much we emit. And then the second being how much warming there is, conditional on how much we emit, and then the impact of warming. And then there's uncertainty about all those three things, which is why some argue, most prominently Martin Weitzman has argued, that there's a lot of tail risk involved with climate change. So there's a great book that he wrote with the economist Gernot Wagner, where he argues that the economics and policy community focuses excessively on sort of the most likely scenarios and doesn't consider the tail risks and kind of unknown unknowns of climate change. So in 2015, he argued that on current policy, or what according to the IEA, the International Energy Agency, was current policy, there's a more than 10% chance of more than 6 degrees of warming. So on that basis, he kind of criticized the more mainstream, I suppose, integrated assessment models, which tried to evaluate the risk of climate change. And he argued that they were kind of underestimating the costs of climate change for that reason. But that doesn't figure, or probably at least until fairly recently, didn't figure too much in the public debate about climate change. It was more like, how bad is 3 degrees going to be? How bad will it be if we go past 2 degrees? That kind of thing, rather than there's a 10% chance of 6 degrees, which would be like much more world changing if that were to happen. But I think things have changed in the last few years for a few reasons. Like there's now less uncertainty than there was about emissions, and less uncertainty there was about climate sensitivity. So I'll first talk about emissions. The climate science impacts and policy community is often focused on this scenario called RCP 8.5, which is the dark red line you can see on the chart here. And on this scenario, emissions are kind of extremely high. They're increasing by a factor of 3 by the end of the century. And a lot of the impacts literature focused on this RCP 8.5 scenario and what might potentially happen to the world in that situation, and treated that as like a business as usual. And I think there's a few reasons to think it's probably not a business as usual scenario. So you can see this chart on the left here shows the increase in per capita coal use on different emission scenarios. And the SSP5 baseline scenarios is marked there, and you can see that per capita coal use increases by nearly a factor of 6, which is sort of very unprecedented and off trend for given like trends in coal use. And then this is happening in a world in which GDP per capita increases enormously. So in all regions, GDP per capita increases beyond $100,000 per head in 2100. So including Africa, including some of the poorest places in the world today. And they had to kind of make these assumptions in order to get emissions as high as on RCP 8.5. But it seems unlikely, if economic growth is that high, that there wouldn't be kind of increasing willingness to get coal off the grid, and also lots of technological progress on alternatives to fossil fuels. So it looks a bit implausible. And then the other thing is that just the continued progress in renewables and batteries and other low carbon technologies, which tend to be kind of neglected by mainstream integrated assessment models. So you can see here, this is a couple of charts from Wei et al. With the reference there, which I'd sort of recommend this paper. It's a really good paper. And basically, mainstream models just kind of can't cope with exponential cost declines, and they just, for that reason, underpredict progress in solar, wind, and batteries. You can see the one on the right is showing the green lines are kind of floor costs for solar in these models. So it's like, this is the lowest that solar can possibly go, and obviously the line is going through those green lines. So yeah. And then there's also been lots of progress on climate policy. Most importantly, China's pledged to get to net zero by 2060. There's lots of other net zero pledges, and climate policy is generally just being beefed up a bit around the world. Obviously not where we'd like it to be, but still a lot stronger than it was. As a result of that, there's a variety of studies which suggest that the more moderate, medium, low RCP 4.5 is now business as usual. You can see here this chart, according to the International Energy Agency, we're more likely to kind of trend towards something on the RCP 8.5 trajectory, and then that implies like a most likely level of warming of about 2.5 degrees rather than the 4 to 5 degrees we thought we were in for on RCP 8.5. In addition to that, the right tail of climate sensitivity is now thinner. So uncertainty has been reduced at the bottom and the top. You can see here this chart from Carbon Brief showing the 90% confidence interval for equilibrium climate sensitivity and how it's been narrowed. There's a paper by Sherwood et al. 2020, which is a really great paper, and I'd recommend reading that for if you're into reading very long climate science papers. But there's a summary on Carbon Brief as well, explaining why that's happened. So for that reason, the business as usual risk has declined a fair bit. And it now looks like 2.5 degrees is the most likely outcome on current policy. And then the chance of 6 degrees now seems to be lower than 1%. So it seems to have fallen by like an order of magnitude compared to when Wagner and Weitzman wrote their book. And that's all on current policy as well. So we might also expect policy to increase in strength in the future. And then, as I mentioned, there's reasons to think that these models, which are projecting likely emissions, are probably too pessimistic on renewables. So they're probably pessimistic in that sense as well. So there's reasons to think that even that is probably too high, given what is probably going to happen. So that's the good news part of the story. But now we also need to think about what is a worst case. When we're deciding what to do, we don't just think about what's the most likely outcome. We need to think about lower probability, high impact events, which is why we wear seatbelts. So what is a worst case? To try and explore that question, I've been trying to think about like how much fossil fuels we could burn. And it turns out that question is sort of surprisingly unclear, mainly because there's lots of uncertainty about available coal resources and how those are actually defined. So the IPCC says that there's about 12 trillion tons of carbon in fossil fuel resources. So for context, we've burned about 450 billion tons so far. So then some studies take this 12 trillion tons figure literally, and then they'll say, okay, so what happens if we burn 12 trillion tons of carbon? And I've like done this, and I thought this was how much we could actually burn. And at this stage, I was like Googling the coldest places in the world and figuring out, well, could they actually survive if we did that? And, you know, it's sort of a bit debatable. But then I learned that not all of the deposits that are classed as resources are actually recoverable. So for coal, for example, only about 50% of underground coal would be recovered typically, just because there's kind of inefficiencies in mining and that kind of thing, and other kinds of losses. And then, like, what is a resource? So a resource is classed as something that could potentially be extracted if technology or prices change. And it's a bit like, well, what does potentially mean, and what does could mean? Like, is it possible to do it? And that is quite different to thinking about what could plausibly happen, what scenario should we take account of. So I spoke to one expert, and he said an example is that there is coal underneath the North Sea, and that's classed as part of Britain's coal resource, but it's also vanishingly unlikely that they'll ever actually try and extract that. Which means that it's a bit kind of hard to know, like, how much recoverable coal is there, like how much could we actually burn. But there's the estimates in the literature that I've seen suggest like the higher end is something like, is more like 3 trillion tons of carbon than 12 trillion tons. And that gets you to something like 2,000 parts per million, which is a level of CO2 concentrations that's potentially unprecedented in, well, it is unprecedented in like tens, if not hundreds of millions of years. But I don't have a great deal of confidence in these estimates of recoverable resources, and I've sort of like explored trying to fund studies that maybe do a better job of getting that number. So then we think, well, given there's all this progress in climate change, why might this happen? And I suppose there's two scenarios we might consider. One is an AGI, like an artificial general intelligence driven growth explosion, which sounds outlandish, but many sort of EAs think there's a decent, i.e. something like 10% chance of something like that happening this century. And then on kind of mainstream growth models, you then get like very, very rapid growth. For that to mean that we burn lots of fossil fuels, the AGI would have to not care about climate change. So that's one potential route. Another is just that decarbonisation gets stuck. So there's all this progress in renewable electricity and in electric cars, but there's some other sectors that are much harder to decarbonize. So things like aviation, shipping, other sectors you can see on this pie chart. And maybe that adds up to like 25% of emissions. So maybe our technological progress is just less good than we think, or there's just not enough willingness to fully execute on climate policy. Some countries continue to burn fossil fuels for a very long time. It seems like a slim chance. Maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A, but that's like maybe a plausible worst case.
John, someone's asking if you can re-say what an AGI is and how that might.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry for the jargon. I apologize for that. Yeah, so artificial general intelligence. So if we make an AI system that is able to substitute for human labor, if you do that, then maybe you get like very rapid growth, like 10% growth, and then the economy's doubling every 7 years or something like that. So yeah, outlandish scenario. Some people think it's plausible. Probably not gonna settle it in this presentation whether it is or not. But anyway, yeah. And then if you burn 3 trillion tons of carbon, my best guess is something like 7 degrees of warming, and then there's a 1 in 6 chance of more than 9.5 degrees of warming. So that's the sort of magnitude of the effect you're looking at. So then what would the impact of this be? Well, this is a nice chart from the latest IPCC report, which has the sort of the text written across the front of it because it's like a draft report. But what this shows is the global surface temperature relative to pre-industrial levels over the last 60 million years. So this current geological era or epoch, I can never remember, that we're currently in, which is the Cenozoic, which started after the end of the dinosaurs. And you can see that there's lots of change. So we're in the Holocene, which is this warmer interglacial period, and you can see in the oops, sorry. If I go back, oh, hang on, there we go. Yeah, you can see in this sort of up to 1 million years ago, there's just lots of transitions in and out of interglacials, and we're currently in a warmer one. It was maybe about 0.5 degree warmer in the last interglacial, but we look set to go past that. And then there's been times that were much warmer again, like the Pliocene was maybe something like 3 degrees warmer. The Miocene, about 6 million years ago, it was around 5 degrees warmer. And then the really interesting analog, or one of the really interesting analogs for future warming, is the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum, which you can see on the left, which is about 56 million years ago. And that was about 17 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels. So it's like a long way off from where we are now. And I think understanding that paleoclimatic context is useful for several reasons. The first is like it allows us to understand how resilient the world is to warming and climate change. And the picture for at least the last 60 million years is that ecosystems have generally thrived despite warming, like these huge episodes of warming on the global level haven't brought mass extinctions in the last 60 million years. They have previous to the Cretaceous, which you can see is started about 165 million years ago. So we could talk about that, like why climate change caused extinctions in the past, but hasn't done since the extinction of the dinosaurs. But it generally looks like ecosystems are kind of quite robust, and we might take that as a signal of like how habitable in general the planet is for humans. And then the other factor is that hominids have survived in a world that was 3 degrees warmer, because hominids were around 6 million years ago, and so would have had to live in that world, and they would have been in Africa, which would have been much warmer than Europe. So there's, I think, some comfort there if we're talking about survivability, looking at from the paleoclimatic evidence. One difference between us and our ancestors, and one difference that we've made to the environment, is that we're reliant on agriculture rather than hunting and gathering. And so one thing we might want to think about is what effect is climate change going to have on agriculture? And so there's several ways that climate change can affect food production. One is through yield. You can see on the right, there's this chart from the IPCC, which shows the effect on yield in different regions. You can see the effects are generally kind of worse in the tropics. Doesn't have that much effect in temperate regions. So like, cooler regions and higher latitudes. And the picture is generally that agricultural progress in yields is probably going to outpace the effects of climate change, at least in terms of the effect of heat. So this isn't taking account of drought. And also agriculture would sort of free up land at higher latitudes. You can see on this chart on the bottom left, the green areas are places that are gaining land, and there's sort of quite substantial gains, but they're all concentrated mainly in China, Russia, and Canada. And then lots of places in the tropics and subtropics are sort of losing out a bit, which looks set to be very bad from a humanitarian point of view, because some of the countries that are least able to adapt to climate change are also the ones that are going to be hit hardest. So lots of humanitarian and global justice reasons to stop emitting fossil fuels. Yeah, and the other effect is drought. I think generally climate models are not very good at predicting the regional effects of climate change for temperature or for rainfall. But nevertheless, you can see the effect of climate change according to a range of models that are assessing effects not only of rainfall but on soil moisture, which is what really affects drought. And you can see that the general prediction is, as shown by the bottom left pane on this chart, that 4 to 5 degrees of warming is kind of increasing droughts across the tropics and subtropics, which would be bad. There is kind of room for adaptive response. So the IPCC assumes that there's lots of scope for irrigation as a response to climate change. And some quite poor countries now employ quite a significant amount of irrigation. So Bangladesh, for example, 80% of farmland there is irrigated. At the dawn of agriculture, whenever it was 10,000 years ago, they made extensive use of irrigation in the Fertile Crescent. So there is scope for that. In richer countries, desalination is an option. For instance, a quarter of Israeli water consumption comes from desalination. But for poorer countries, again, looks like it could be bad. And then another thing we might want to think about is temperature thresholds for warming, and like when does it actually become impossible to do agriculture in different regions. So these are the sort of 5 main agricultural regions, and this is my own research, but this is like how much warming you would need to destroy 8 months of the growing season, which is what you plausibly need to do to like destroy the food supply entirely or something via the thermal effect of warming on crops. And you can see it's like very high in lots of places. Maybe we could do, if we burn all the fossil fuels, it might happen in India, but other places it seems kind of out of reach. One other way climate change could be bad is if it sets off some tipping point which affects agriculture. So warming is, other things equal, kind of better than cooling for agriculture, because cooling kind of destroys the growing season. If you have one day of frost, that completely ruins your growing season, which is why nuclear winter is bad. And one way that climate change might lead to cooling is from a collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which is one of those things that seems kind of hard to model. There's not much model agreement on it, but you can see here from the IPCC special report on the cryosphere that at 4 degrees of warming, there's something like a 5% chance of a collapse. And then the chart on the right shows the effect that a collapse of the AMOC on the world, and you can see cooling across the northern hemisphere, including most of the main food producers. And it kind of, no one's really studied the global effects this might have, but it looks kind of similar to a small nuclear winter, which some researchers think would kill hundreds of millions of people. So that's something to take into consideration. Another way you might think climate change could affect agriculture is through causing ecosystem collapse. In my view, the risks of this, I suppose I should explain what the thought there might be. And the idea is that, so some models suggest that climate change is going to damage ecosystems, and then maybe agriculture relies in some way on these ecosystems, and that kind of ecosystem collapse leads to the destruction of agriculture. In my view, the risk is low for several reasons. I can envision this being like one of the more controversial parts of the talk, but here we go. So one reason is past experience. So you can see the chart on the bottom right shows woodland in England as a percentage of land area, and you can see that we've just kind of destroyed all of our virgin ecosystems in England without causing ecosystem collapse, leading to sort of societal collapse. And that's kind of true across Eurasia. There's just been lots of ecosystem destruction without completely destroying agriculture. In fact, the kind of reverse has happened. So we have reasons to care about ecosystem collapse, but the sort of connection to destroying agriculture still seems a bit opaque. Another factor to consider is that agriculture is sort of very spread out across the world, and different crops are kind of very reliant on different kinds of ecosystems. So, some crops are pollinated by bees and some aren't. And, you just generally expect with so many different kinds of crops that they're going to be reliant on different ecosystems. And it's kind of hard to see why they would all simultaneously fail. The third reason is, as I alluded to before, the link, at least in our current geological era, the climate change biodiversity loss link seems weak. But that's kind of me going against the IPCC there. So you might want to take that with a bit of a grain of salt, like that they put more weight on these models, which suggests a lot of species loss. And there are differences between today and past episodes of warming because of additional anthropogenic stresses on ecosystems. So it might be that something is importantly different now that leads to greater loss of ecosystem services in the future. Finally, another factor to consider is that there's countervailing increases in forest cover. So you can see this chart from our World in Data. Starting in 1990, forest area has increased in temperate regions, and the rate of forest loss is declining in tropical regions. And forests are sort of the main determinant of how well biodiversity is doing. So that might be a reason to think that we're not going to get this global scale biodiversity crisis. It's much more of a local thing, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. Another thing we want to think about, so that's kind of the review of the effect on agriculture. Another thing we want to think about is tipping points. So as should be clear from the graph from the IPCC, the climate is not naturally stable. And I don't mean that in a climate skeptically way. I mean it in maybe we could tip it into some other state way. And what's clear is that there've been cases of much higher temperatures. There've been cases of rapid warming on a regional basis, of climate systems shifting into drought, and of very large change at the regional level. And anthropogenic warming is much faster than past warming. The chart you saw before of temperatures over time is on geological timescales. For example, the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum 56 million years ago. That happened over the course of about 10,000 years. So that was 5 degrees of warming over 10,000 years, whereas we might do 5 degrees of warming over a few hundred years. So very different kind of ball game. So there seems to be prima facie reason to think that there could be tipping points. But then on the other hand, there's also reason to think the climate can't be extremely unstable. Otherwise, kind of we and other life wouldn't be here. If it was very easy to tip off really, really damaging climate tipping points, then the world wouldn't have survived to this day, basically. And two runaway tipping points that people have talked about are the runaway greenhouse and the moist greenhouse. The consensus in the literature is that the runaway greenhouse doesn't seem possible with fossil fuel burning, and the moist greenhouse effect in The Precipice by Toby Ord, which I sort of did some of the research for the climate change section of that. He argues that moist greenhouse is this kind of unknown risk that could potentially kill life on Earth, because the oceans would be lost to space, and so that would kind of sterilize the biosphere, basically. But I think CO2 concentrations would just decline naturally over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, long before the oceans will be lost to space. I think there could only be a moist greenhouse caused by the sun getting brighter, which would happen over hundreds of millions of years. So there you go, something to feel better about. And yeah, that being said, there's still other tipping points and there's kind of unknown unknowns that we're stepping a bit outside of our climatic lane. One that's been talked about is we rapidly lose clouds, and that leads to 8-degree warming over the course of a few years, which in this paper by Schneider et al. In 2019 is maybe the most worrying climate science paper of recent years. Again, that is on the worst case emissions scenario, so that we'd have to go past 1,200 parts per million from we're at about 415 parts per million today, and adding about 2 to 3 parts per million per year. So it would take several centuries, but still, it does illustrate that there's kind of potentially unknown unknowns that we haven't thought about, and our models are probably quite imperfect. Another one people talk about is conflict, so the indirect effects. And there's very, very heated disagreement in the literature among scholars about how important climate change is for causing conflict. But there is, at the same time, generally consensus that it's a small driver of conflict relative to other factors. So there's a study by Mack et al., which includes like the most heated partisans on either side of the debate. And even in that study, which, as I said, included the pessimistic people, climate change was ranked fairly low compared to other factors. And it also seems like a weak driver of great power conflict. If you're worried about conflict between the emerging powers like India and China and the US, and also taking into account like the US and Russia, more established powers, the main dynamic that people posit there is that there's kind of rising powers supplanting American influence in the world, and for some reason America decides to go to war over that. So climate change, like, it's not that climate change can't kind of figure in that causal explanation, it's just like it's not a big lever. All that being said, as I've intimated, in this worst case world, if you're looking at more than 7 degrees of warming, it's sort of a bit hard to know what the effect would be, and it's hard to know what kind of world it would create. So there's probably kind of, again, model uncertainty related risks associated with that. So yeah, overall, I think some cause for optimism on the trajectory that things seem to be going on. Like, let's keep going on that. Make clean energy cheap and get rid of coal would be good. And then, like, I think the most likely level of warming and more extreme levels of warming generally seem very bad for poor agrarian countries in the tropics, with the least ability to adapt, but have also contributed the least to the problem. So there's like lots of reasons from lots of different ethical points of view to not do that. That being said, it seems like from what we know of the science, the worst case falls short of destroying human civilization. But there may be global catastrophic risk from tipping points. Perhaps there's indirect risk from conflict and instability, and that's especially true if emissions are very high. So there we go. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks, John. Yeah, it's nice to have the good and the bad all together. Cool. So there's a few questions that we'll jump onto, and I think I'll start with one that I had, and I think someone else, Martin, had it as well. When you were talking about the emissions, like the warming expectation of the total recoverable amount of coal, like 3 trillion tons, I think you said your median estimate's about 7 degrees, and that seems like fairly low. I would have thought, for like, I've seen higher estimates than that based purely on tipping point. So is that the direct emissions, or how come that number is not as high as we might expect?
Yeah, so there's a paper by Tokarska et al. Which looks at the climate effect of 5 trillion tons of carbon, and they estimated that once you account for non-CO2 greenhouse gases, you're looking at something like 10 to 11 degrees of warming. So I think for 3 trillion tons of carbon, it's in the right ballpark. The method for calculating it was that you use this metric called the transient climate response to cumulative emissions, which the IPCC estimates is about 1.7. per, so climate scientists think that warming is kind of proportional to cumulative emissions. So for every trillion tons of carbon, we get a given amount of warming. So for 3 tons of carbon, so for each trillion ton of carbon, we get 1.7 degrees of warming. So for 3, we get something like, we get something like, what are we on there, 5.1, and then you kind of add in the effects of non-CO2 greenhouse gases and also forestry, and then you get close to 7. That's how it's calculated. So it's using the IPCC's estimate for that. But then there's also, as you sort of suggested, reasons to think that we should have less confidence once emissions get that high, because we have less information. It just gets more out of sample, I suppose, and the IPCC is less confident the relationship holds once you get towards 3 trillion tons of carbon and past 1 trillion ton of carbon.
Cool, thanks for that. And there's a good question by Martha about how come there's such a big emphasis on coal during your presentation in terms of like the earlier sections?
Emphasis on coal. Well, if I suppose the reason to focus on it was that if you're going to have these very high emission scenarios, we need to burn a lot of coal, and that looks less likely now. So the International Energy Agency thinks that coal use peaked in 2014. So if you're going to have these very high emission scenarios, you'd have to think there's going to be this big takeoff in coal, which doesn't seem that plausible anymore by the looks of it.
Cool. And then Catherine had a question. I think the crux of it is about the estimates for agricultural yields, and you said you were basing it mainly off direct temperature effects, but she said there's already been severe droughts which have affected yield. So I guess how does the yield picture change when you include things like droughts and other kind of weather events besides temperature increases?
Yeah, in the last impacts report, they kind of assumed that you'd be able to use irrigation as like you'd be able to use irrigation to adapt to droughts, but that may not be true in the real world. But I'm not sure what like the combined effect is if you sort of assume realistic adaptation and account for effects on and account for effects of temperature on yield. But like they're not looking at sort of dramatic increases in irrigation to be able to account for like 4 to 5 degrees of warming in lots of regions. So I think kind of seems like it could be very bad in lots of kind of poor agrarian countries that have low technology, but yeah, I'm not sure what like the combined effect might be of that, but something just kind of have to consider separately.
Cool. Maybe I'll Herbie, do you want to read out your question? I think might be nice this one actually reads out that question, and yours is a bit more content in it. If you're happy to read it out and say it out loud. You're muted, or I can't hear you for some reason. Uh-oh. If it doesn't work, I will say it, but.
Okay, does this work?
Yes, it's all good, go for it.
Okay, great. So this is related to the crop yields and drought question, I guess, but last September, Chatham House produced a climate change risk assessment, which I'm not sure if you've seen it, but it included some forecasts about the probability of synchronous crop failures. And it was focused, one of the forecasts was failure due to severe drought in the top 4 maize producing countries was greater than 50% to happen sometime during the 2040s. And this is based on, if I believe, find the link to the paper. Yes, this paper. Future warming increases probability of globally synchronized maize production shocks. And so I was just kind of curious as to how this fitted in with your analysis, but it might have been already partially answered with the answer to the previous question.
Yeah, I have read that paper. So yeah, it's kind of, if I recall correctly, it's sort of assuming, I think it assumes kind of 4 to 5 degrees of warming, and then where do we get, yeah, what's the probability of synchronous failure in maize specifically? Yeah, I mean, it seems like there is an increased risk of synchronous failure in some crops. I think that's risk has probably been a bit exaggerated to mean that like all crops are going to fail at the same time, which I don't think is realistic. And I think, you know, the first thing is there are many other staple crops. So it doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be like a complete kind of loss of food. And yeah, a lot depends on what assumptions you make about adaptation and whether you think we'll use lots of irrigation to kind of deal with increasing droughts. But yeah, I'd probably have to go back and look at the paper to remember my sort of considered view on it.
Cool. Yeah, we'll get maybe slightly more zoomed out question now from Chris, which is quite interesting. It's, I guess, do you have any comments, John, on about the lack of interest potentially within effective altruism on climate change, but outside of the X risk or like the global catastrophic risk scenario? So I guess maybe the question here is, do you see there's a case for it being made from a global health and development perspective compared to other global health and development interventions?
Yeah, well, I think open philanthropy is now looking at it from that point of view, so it might get more money in the future. Yeah, it's kind of a bit of a halfway house, I think, of kind of not being picked up by the X-risk people, and then the global development people focusing on something that's more, yeah, traditional, I suppose. But I think, yeah, I think there's a few reasons probably to think that maybe it should get more attention from a kind of global development point of view. Like, one is there's this associated air pollution costs which kill millions and millions of people every year, and then like who knows what the true economic costs of climate change are going to be over the next few decades. Like you could imagine calculations where they're bad enough to make it kind of in the AMF ballpark. Like, I don't have a lot of faith in a lot of these economic models, but yeah, it'd be interesting if someone were to look at that, which I think is what open philanthropy are trying to do at the moment.
Cool. That's quite another looking more into that. But actually, I think Rethink Priorities actually did hire some climate-focused people within their global health and development team as well. So I guess there's maybe a bit more interest coming slowly.
Yeah, well, I think they're doing it at the behest of OpenPhil, is my understanding. Yeah,
makes sense. Cool, John. You had a few comments about climate change with regards to AI. Do you want to read out your question? Because probably easier for you because you have a gist of what you're thinking rather than me trying to analyze your two comments. It's John M, if you're up for it. Wherever you might be. If not, I will. No, I don't know if he's here. Okay, in that case, I'll keep going. Louisa, you had a question as well. I don't know if you want to read out your question about the relative priorities of climate change versus biodiversity, if you're up for that, or I can read it out. Yes.
Well, I can read it out.
Go for it.
Saying how you balance the relative priorities of biodiversity versus reducing climate change, particularly relevant where I live is near the route of a high-speed rail construction. And sadly, it seems generally the environmentalists are opposed to it. And often I hear them talk about stop HS2 within the same breath, say tackle the climate emergency. Or hang on, surely making rail travel more affordable, being able to compete with airplanes should be better for the environment.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of, I suppose in the presentation, I was looking at it mainly from like, how could this affect human civilization? But you might also think there's lots of reasons to care intrinsically about biodiversity. And that's obviously like a very fraught question of exactly how to value that. And I don't know what the answer is, but yeah.
Yeah, that is a tough values question, I guess. Yeah, that is a more challenging one. Peter had some question about when estimating temperature is required to reduce growing season by 8 months. Why did you choose 8 months?
Yeah, so because the growing season for the most of the major food crops is 4 months, apart from one particular type of wheat, as I understand it. So that was why it was this kind of extreme scenario, like, you know, pushing it to the very limit. How much warming would there need to be? So that was the rationale. But there's reasons to think that, you know, the true threshold would probably be before that. I mean, if there was like 20 degrees of warming, then, you know, the world's going to be very different anyway. But yeah, that was why.
Cool, sounds good. And Barney, do you want to read out your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, John, for a great talk. I was interested in your 17 degrees C, which the world has withstood in the past, and life seems to have thrived fine. So maybe there's no reason to doubt that we'd be able to adapt to 4 or 5 degrees C. But historically, plants and animals have had thousands of years to adapt, whereas we could be facing a sudden rise of 5 to 6 degrees. And yet you seem pretty confident that life on the whole, obviously there would be a lot of casualties, but that we wouldn't be facing mass extinction. And I'm just I'm not sure if I'm sharing your optimism that when we're faced with the rise so quickly that we would be able to adapt.
Yeah, good question. So I think that's right. It was much slower for the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum, but there have been cases of rapid regional warming in the transition from the last ice age into our current geological epoch. So there's in different areas there was warming on the order of like 2 to 10 degrees Celsius per century in various different regions as we sort of transitioned into the Holocene, which is the current geological epoch. And the picture that emerges is like lots of kind of turnover, but no like regional extirpations. So I think there is some comfort there. Like the one big difference might be that we've had this impact on the environment through other ways, like obviously the main ways through agriculture. So that kind of eliminates some of the sort of refuges where species might go, and that's kind of the counter argument to there being ecosystem collapse. I wouldn't say like really confident that it's not going to happen, but I think it's sort of mainly a problem for sort of endemic species that are like adapted to a very specific environment, and less so. And then when you're looking at this question of like how are ecosystem services going to affect agriculture, it's kind of not really dependent on exclusively locally agriculture is not really dependent on like exclusively locally adapted species. So yeah, that would be what I'd say.
Thanks.
Cool. And I'll have a question if I can use my facilitator privilege. I guess like a more broad scale, like, so I guess you said some of your 2 main takeaways is we should basically stop coal and have more cheap, clean energy. I guess, what would you recommend for people who are either hearing this talk in terms of like tangible things they can do to support those kind of efforts in terms of whether it's like strategy, advocacy, donations? Yeah. What do you think on like a practical level?
Yeah, I think there's lots of things you can do practically. Like one is keep voting for strong environmental policies, and then try and, you know, if you have the skill set, try and get involved with nonprofits that are doing good work. Like your time is a very valuable resource, so you know, use it. There's lots of opportunities to do that. Yeah, and then there's also lots of nonprofits that you can donate to that I think do lots of good work. Like my former employer, Founders Pledges, as a climate fund you can donate to, and I think they fund a lot of good charities. Most of them I would agree with. So yeah, there's lots you can do.
Cool. And actually, there's some stuff on the, now I'll do my shameless plug, is on the effective environmentalism page, there's a few resources you can do in terms of like charity recommendations, career advice, and if you want to reach out for a one-to-one call, we also do that, and general events. So that's a good place to come for practical, nice hands-on stuff to do. Maybe we'll do 1 or 2 more questions and we'll wrap it up. One was from Chris about if basically you have any more information on the research by DPhil on the climate focused stuff, if you have any more flavor of what that's going to involve or what that look into.
Well, they're looking into what the social cost of carbon plausibly might be. Big question. And I think they're going to publish that in the next few months. And then I know they're also looking into whether preventing deforestation is cost effective. In my view, it's not. And yeah, I assume in the next few months as well, but I'm not sure that exhausts what they're looking into. But I know they're looking into lots of aspects of it and wanting to give more in the space.
Cool, sounds good. And maybe we'll do one more for Matthew, which is why do you think that largely that climate philanthropy in general, and maybe EA climate philanthropy as included, has focused more on mitigation rather than adaptation? Yeah, for like especially those who'd be most impacted, like you said, those in the more kind of tropical areas.
Yeah, a good question. I mean, I suppose I'm partly culpable for that, having done some of the research on effective charities. Yeah, I just don't know what you would do on the adaptation. I mean, it's more just, I don't know whether there's a good principled reason. It just kind of hasn't been done. But I could imagine there being lots of things maybe that might be good, like heat tolerant crops, and yeah, I don't know. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's just there's no particularly good reason for it.
So you think it's more of an issue of like tractability rather than the case isn't that strong?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's like stronger incentives to deal with to like prepare for adaptation. So countries have like reason to, like Bangladesh has reason itself to fund flood defenses, for example, whereas there's this big like collective action problem involved in reducing carbon emissions. So there's maybe more of a case for philanthropy in that case.
Mm-hmm.
But I suppose the counter argument might be, if countries don't have the resources to be able to adapt, we need to like provide them with them, especially if there's like this global justice reason that we're also inflicting this harm on them as well.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool. We will wrap it up there then. That was a good last question. And cool. So thanks everyone for coming. That's been really interesting. I'm going to pop a few things in the chat, but I guess first of all, thank you, John, so much for your time. That was super, super interesting. And there will be a recording, and also I'll do a follow-up email, which will have a link to the post where John and Johannes wrote on the EA forum, which has a bit more content kind of fleshed out in a written form if you want to read that as well. And yeah, the links I put in the chat basically is, yeah, we have 3 or 4 more upcoming talks. We have 2 on carbon removal with some great charities. One with Matthew, who's here right now, about electricity kind of consumption and usage. And the final one is with Kirsty from TerraPraxis on nuclear advocacy, which is, again, all very interesting topics. But otherwise, we have a Facebook page if you want to get involved and kind of hear upcoming events, chat a bit more, see what's happening in space. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So thanks everyone for coming, especially you, John. Thanks for giving us your time, and hopefully see you all on Saturday 5th at the next talk. And have a nice rest of the weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.